Hello friends, and welcome to another Atomic Mass Transmissions Live. I'm John, and today I'm going to be talking about working with clear plastic parts and painting the interior of some of the new vehicles that we have coming up. So these new vehicles that we have, the LAAT LE and the Aa5 Speeder Truck, both have clear canopies and clear windshields, and they also have fully detailed interiors. So I wanted to share a little bit of my approach when it comes to painting the interiors of these miniatures, and also just general best practices when you're working with miniatures like BX battle droids that have their clear shields, the land speeder, flying stands, all sorts of different stuff. So this is going to be kind of an involved stream, and it's going to go over two sessions. So we'll be back here next week covering the kind of culmination of putting all this stuff together. So there's a lot of stuff to cover, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Okay, we've kind of set up a bit of a different setup here because I plan on doing a little bit of airbrushing today. Just because I have moved the mic and everything else, can I get a confirmation in the chat that everything sounds all right? And we're doing okay. In the meantime, I will kind of show off this LAAT that I have. So I have decided on this one, based on the wonderful idea from my good friend Gavin, to take some of my extra Inferno Squad miniatures and put them in the back here. So I've kind of blue tacked them in there just to show you where they're actually going to wind up. And then today we're going to be covering a little bit of the procedure in actually airbrushing up this part. So I've already done that to one half of the miniature here, but I'm going to cover doing it on the other half here, and then I'll also show how this whole thing kind of breaks apart, so we can actually get in there and reach all this stuff and paint it before we glue it all back together again. So this general approach also applies to a number of other miniatures that we have. So I kind of wanted to talk about those before we get into the nitty-gritty with the LAAT here. And the first one is going to be this Aa5 Speeder Truck. So we've got, this big fella that we have seen before. Clear windshield here on the front. This thing is pretty easy because it just drops right in there without too much of a problem at all. But if you want to actually get in there to be able to paint all this interior, you have to do a couple different things. So I think in a previous stream, Will showed off the fact that, this top panel can pop off. So let me just pop this guy off of here. This reveals all the cool stuff on the inside, but also what I have done is I have not glued on these halves, like these either half of this. And the reason why, A, is just so I can get in there and I can actually reach all of this stuff. And B, there is this kind of cockpit cover section that goes over top that obscures a lot of this stuff. And that rests underneath this half and the other half that's sandwiched together. So I left both of these sections loose, so I can get in here and I can pop that loose, and then I can take this bit off. And now I've got everything in here that's accessible. So you've glued all of the floorboards down, all the interior cockpits, all that other stuff. And I've also decided to leave the driver here loose as well. You can pop him out as well, and you can pop him off and then put him back in there. And I just have a glue point here where his hand connects to the little lever down at the bottom. You could also just leave that whole part separate and just make this whole thing just be able to pop out just like that. So when it comes to painting all of this, I would then base coat all of this, probably choose a contrasting color for the interior from the hull so it just really stands out, paint all these components, and then drop all these parts back in over top and just reassemble it all. We'll probably cover this detailed process much like we're doing here today on the LAAT. But it's a little involved, so I wanted to save that for a later date. So in addition to that, there are also some miniatures that are actually a lot easier to achieve this with. And a good example of that one is the land speeder for the Rebels. This one has got an exposed cockpit pretty much across the whole top portion. And this section can just pop right off. And you can add this later, so you can make it so all these crew members are removable. You can get in there and you can paint all this interior detail. There's also a clear stand down here on the bottom, so you probably want to leave that separate from the base. or you could opt to tape it up and use some masking tape, kind of like what I've done here with the front cockpit of the LAAT. And that will just ensure that you won't get any paint on those clear parts anywhere. So one point of distinction here is that when we made these, this miniature in particular, the plastic that is used for this windshield is a little bit different than what we're using now on the LAAT and the Aa5. So the newer clear plastic parts can be glued down with plastic glue, but plastic glue does not work on this particular windshield because it's an older part of plastic. So what I would do at this point, after I've gone through and I've painted this entire miniature, I would then use a little bit of white glue to drop this thing down. And it's pretty easy because it has some little tabs here on the bottom. It's got some little slots in there. My only word of caution is you might want to glue down that windshield, because if you want to use this rocket launcher here on the side, their leg goes inside of the cockpit, and you want to make sure that you have clearance for that. So I would recommend going through painting all the external parts. And when it comes to doing like these individual characters and stuff, I just use a piece of two-sided tape. Just show you the example that I have here for the LAAT, a piece of two-sided foam tape, and then I just stick all the parts to it, and then I can just hold this piece of plastic card or a ruler, whatever you wanted to utilize, to be able to paint all this stuff a little bit easier, and you don't have to worry about holding these little tiny and fiddly parts. Lastly, there's like the BX droids in particular. They have some shields that have a clear section on those. And I think you're probably all familiar with what they look like, but there is a plastic frame that goes on the exterior portion, and then there is a shield part that goes in the middle of that. Just like this. So this little part just rests inside of here, but I find that it is much easier, rather than trying to dodge around all that stuff, to just paint the frame of the shield separately, kind of like in this example that I have, and just do all of your little edge highlights if you want to, or however you want to paint them, if you want to dry brush them, what have you. And then in order to attach it, you can either, again, use white glue if you so choose, or if you want a little bit of a stronger join, you can take a really fine grit sandpaper and sand the connection point here on the interior of the shield, so that where it meets up with the actual clear part, you have a good connection point. And then you can just use a little bit of plastic glue to attach that as it goes on. Other word of caution is if you're using any sort of overspray or dull coat or anything of that sort to seal your miniatures, it will fog up these clear plastic parts. So I would highly recommend that you before you attach this part, you might want to actually spray over top of just the frame of the shield first with a varnish, and then attach it to the miniature afterwards. Same is true for all these cockpits and these other sections here. So you want to leave those things separate. Now for the windshield for the Aa5 and also the LAAT, there are these like raised sections here on the top that are, it's kind of like the frame for the clear windows. And that's why I have opted to mask all of the clear windows off here, so it makes this a little bit easier to paint. And the way that I go about that is I just take, I use painter's tape because it has a really low tack and it's easy to reposition. And I just line up one edge here with the side of the frame, push it into place. See if I can get that situated just right. Get that kind of pressed in. And then I use my thumbnail or like a pencil or something like that to kind of like score down along the edge as tightly as I can. And then I will use a sharp X-Acto knife to trim it up. And just kind of follow that, that frame around the side. And being careful not to get any stray marks on the clear parts that you want to protect. And then similarly, the surface of these clear parts are pretty slick and they're a little bit difficult to paint. So what I will do is then just take, again, this really light kind of 400 grain or grit sandpaper, and then just kind of lightly sand the tops of these things because I intend to paint them. Just make sure that before you actually go in there with the paint that you wipe these things off pretty well so you don't have any sort of dust or debris in there that might mix in with your paint and affect your overall finish. Cool. So we moved over here because we're going to do a little bit of airbrushing in particular, but let's talk a little bit about how this LAAT goes together and what I have done to make it so we can access all the parts. So this thing breaks down into a number of sub-assemblies, and the first one is up here on the very top, and this part can pop off here. Let's see if I can get it loose. So it connects here with these 3 little pins that are on the side, and then there are 2 halves that go together on either side. And these things can also pop apart. And then inside of that, there is a crew compartment section inside of here. And this is also a part that I've left loose. So all these things can kind of come apart. So you've got the 2 halves on either side. You've got this crew compartment here, which I've also kind of assembled in such a way so I can pull the roof off. And then you can see here, these are the 2 miniatures that I put on the interior. The space is a little bit too small to actually fit a miniature on top of a base. So I'm going for more of the kind of diorama approach where these miniatures will just be glued and live in there. Now, if you wanted to be particularly ambitious, you could certainly sink some magnets into the bottom there and possibly put some magnets on the bottom of a base, and then you can pop them out and then just drop them right back in. So this I think looks super cool. I really like how you've got this one kind of sniper in the back. You got this other guy over here. He's got his hand on a big red button over on the side, and it should make for like a really cool presentation at the end. I might even get crazy and do like somebody like rappelling off the side or something. We'll see. We'll see once it all kind of comes together. So I primed the entire miniature with a gray primer, and I will use a little bit of airbrushing to kind of deepen some of the shadows. And then I find with airbrushing, it usually works out best if you start with the darkest colors first, airbrush up the lighter colors, and then you can define some of the recessed areas with a wash or shade or just kind of lining in. Looking at the chat here, there's only one pilot mini option for the Aa5, but the head is removable, and you could certainly swap it out with a Duros if you wanted to make Shriv Shurgav, or just put other aliens or other crew members. All the parts are pretty interchangeable, and they're all very similar in proportions and scale. So I think that you could make that your driver into whatever one you wanted to. So I showed before the pilots for the Imperial side. So they have these cool kind of Inferno Squad pilot helmets, and they'll fit in very well, I think, with the other crew members that are in the back. And because I'm sure that people are going to ask about it, here are the clone pilots that come with it as well. You can see there. So they have 2 options in their arms. They can either have their arms at rest, and then you can put the little control handle, I suppose, into the side of the crew compartment, or you can have both of their hands just at their side like that. And the crew compartment is it's a pretty snug affair. If you look here, this is the interior of one of the sides. So there are these little holes here on the side where you can actually glue down the handles and attach those. And then the pilot seats kind of rest. There's these little notches here, and they rest on the inside. So if you're going to paint the pilots on the interior, I highly recommend you think about approaching it this way, where you leave these things in separate halves. You can get in here and access all this stuff pretty easily, and then paint the pilot separate, and then glue them into one half, and then sandwich the whole thing together and glue it all together. And kind of in a very similar fashion with the BX droids, to ensure that that seam joins up really well. First of all, I primed it with it kind of facing down, so not a whole lot of primer got on the interior. You won't see any of this stuff anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But you could also use that fine grit sandpaper and just kind of sand off that edge a little bit, so you can get just the natural plastic on plastic connection that you're going to need for the plastic glue to join. Now, you could also use super glue if you wanted to connect these things, but it's kind of risky because if you apply too much super glue and it's not properly ventilated, it can cause like a hazy, frosty effect that can kind of ruin the overall finish. So I usually recommend, when working with these clear parts, to utilize plastic glue if the parts will accept it, which the new vehicles can, or you use some white glue to attach stuff. Cool. So let's start in a little bit on the airbrushing side of things. And what I did previous for this, and I will have to apologize that there's going to be a little bit of background noise. It's going to be a little loud when I turn on the fan here in a second. But just let me know if you can't hear me or anything. We can make some adjustments. So what I've done is I've gotten this piece of plastic card and that two-sided foam tape. I like it a lot. And then I can just take this whole section here and I can just push it onto that thing, and it will hold. You know, just kind of push it on there a little bit firm, and it'll hold on there. And now I have something to hold on to while I'm airbrushing this miniature. So let me move some of this stuff out of the way. We'll start to, I'll show you the process that I went through to achieve this color here, this kind of green color that I use for the rest of my Imperial forces. I'm going to paint up this miniature in a very similar scheme to this occupier tank. And it will become a little bit more kind of rusty and weathered, I suppose. I'm not going quite so heavy with the rust chips on it. I want this to be a little bit more of a new looking vehicle, but the wash that I'll apply afterwards will help kind of tint this color down and go from this kind of lighter minty green to the more military green that we have here. All right. So let me get set up here, and then we'll get to a little bit of airbrushing and then start to fill in some details. Again, this is going to be a two-part stream, so I'll be back here next Friday. We'll be finishing all this stuff up. I'm probably going to spend my weekend just painting some of the crew and other things like that, so you guys can really get all the information about actually putting all this stuff together, as opposed to getting bogged down with the specifics of painting pilots and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, both of these vehicles are closed transport. It's going to open up a ton of new options for these two factions. They have a bunch of different pilot options available. We'll be kind of showing off some more of that stuff via social over the coming weeks as we get closer to release. Lots of cool new options. Some real doozies yet to reveal. So I'm looking forward to sharing all that stuff with you guys a bit later on. Okay. So let's kick on this fan and make sure that the sound sounds all right and it's not driving people crazy. Can you guys hear me okay? Let me just making sure that the sound and everything is all right. It's probably going to sound a little bit weird because of the noise canceling stuff on my microphone. Oh, you can get foam tape. I got that stuff at the grocery store. They sell it in rolls. You can get it at Home Depot or any other home improvement store, anywhere like that. Awesome, cool. Sounds like it sounds all right. Okay, so let me turn on my airbrush compressor here. We're using a dual action airbrush. So dual action means that it combines air by pushing things down, and then it mixes in paint by pulling the trigger back. It's a pretty standard approach, and I highly recommend that if you're thinking about airbrushing, that you look into a dual action gravity-fed airbrush. Gravity-fed means that it has a cup at the top of the airbrush here, as opposed to a bottle down below that it siphons the paint up through. And to start off with, whenever I am mixing up my paint for airbrush, I always use a thinner first, so flow improver or thinner, anything that's designed for airbrushing, and I like to put it in a squeeze bottle like this guy right here, and I will fill up the cup, you know, I don't know, maybe like a 1/4 of an inch or something down at the bottom, but general rule of thumb is I like to do a mix of about maybe 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner, or maybe in some cases, if I'm thinning down just standard acrylic paints, I will do a 1-to-1 ratio, and that just ensures that it flows through there really well. I can always thicken it up if I need to. So for the shadows and the initial coat here, I'm going to use graphene gray from Scale Color. It's a kind of a dark, nice gray, and this is just a standard acrylic paint. It's not specifically designed for airbrushing, but works just fine. And I will pour some of this stuff on the side of the cup, and then I'll use a spare brush. Let me see if I can find one here. Gotta reach, hold on. Okay. and then I will mix up that paint into the thinner until it is nice and mixed up. I do this because it ensures that you don't put just straight undiluted paint into the bottom where the needle and the nozzle and everything is. It will automatically just reach contact with those internal parts as a thinned product to begin with. So let's just test it here on my hand, just see how that goes. Cool, that looks a little thin to me, so I'm gonna add just a little bit more. And that's usually the case, is you just kind of like testing it and eyeballing it and just making sure that it's gonna be thick enough for what you wanna use it for. Okay, so just mix in a little bit more of this graphene gray. And for this initial pass, what I'm really focusing on doing is just any areas that are really deep and recessed, I wanna kind of hit up with this gray color. So general best practice when you're airbrushing, rather than just starting the airflow right on top of the miniature like this, I like to start off to the side, so I'm shooting over and above it, push down, and then bring the airbrush over top of it. So this coat is going to go over most of this because we want it to be pretty dark down here in these recesses and these lower portions, especially down on the bottom of the actual craft, on the interior of these wing bits here on the side. And I'll try to maneuver this so you guys can see it pretty well. And it's not a whole lot darker than the base coat color, but I like to have this as a base because it's easier to color match later than if I was just trying to match the straight primer, because this is a color right out of the bottle. So you don't want to dwell in any one specific spot for too long. If you start to see it being shiny, like if you see a sheen like in that lower portion, you want to kind of move around, because if you see that sheen, the paint is still pretty wet, and you're going to have a higher chance of it starting to pool and create problems for you and start to run and do some weird stuff. So just try to keep moving around the miniature as well as you possibly can. And just do multiple passes and multiple coats on this. Put up this section over here. Cool. Hopefully this is a bit of an experiment. We have, first time I've actually tried to airbrush here on stream, so just want to make sure that the sound and everything is okay, but it sounds like you guys can hear me all right. Okay, and I want a bit of a fade here from the interior of this door down to the tip, so I start off closer, and then as I move away, I increase the distance. So I start out here close, and then as I move away and move down towards the bottom of this thing, I'm moving my hand further and further away. That's going to just disperse the particles a little bit more and help out with your fades. Okay. Okay, I think I've gotten most of the dark spots that I wanted, maybe on the bottom under here. So let's transition over to a lighter color. Oh, and I guess just general airbrush good practice. I like to use a spray out pot like this one. This is a very common thing we're airbrushing. So when you're going to change and go in between colors, I'll take a little bit of airbrush cleaner that I've just got in this squeeze bottle here, put it up into the cup, and then you can just spray it through into this pot, and it won't put a lot of fumes or anything up in the air. So just kind of spray that through. That should work out okay. Okay, so our next color I'm going to use, and the base color that I use for all of my Imperial vehicles is this German uniform. So again, we're going to take a little bit of the thinner, we're going to drop it down into the cup, mix in about an equal amount or maybe a little bit more of paint. Let's see if you guys can see that okay. And use your brush to thin it out. Mix it up really well in there. Some people like to use like a little external cup and mix all this stuff and then pour it all in. Whatever your preference is. This is just how I generally go about it. That looks a little bit thick. We'll see if it's how well it sprays. So we'll just test it over here on the side. That's looking pretty good. All right, so starting here at the top, this is going to be an overcoat that's going to cover a lot of the miniatures. So but I want to leave just a little bit of that darker gray down as this kind of as these areas kind of recede into shadow here. So again, kind of spray off the miniature and move on to it. This paint is looking a little chunky and a little speckly, so I'm going to add a little bit more thinner to it. I can just kind of see it coming out in kind of a spattery texture. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of this and mix it up, just so it can hopefully flow through there a little bit better. Okay, back to this. Test it over here again. And sometimes you just need to like spray it through. Like largely, most of the time you're gonna have problems with your airbrush is when paint is drying here at the tip of it. So you have to be very careful. That tip is very delicate and you don't ever really want to like stab at it. But I can use my fingers or a brush or something like that and clean off any sort of excess paint as it collects up there on the top. And you just want to do that periodically. If you just keep on spraying the entire time, paint will start to build up here on the nozzle and then air won't flow over it properly and it's going to cause problems for you. Okay. And I'm mostly just starting at like the extremities where things like go, where any parts kind of join together. I like to leave a little bit of that dark area just because it helps define the shapes a little bit. And you can just kind of like move around this and just hit up all these areas. Again, if you start to see it being really shiny like that, just move on to a different area and let it dry, because if you keep spraying in that spot, it's going to start to pool and it's going to run on you. That's bad news. You almost always want to just kind of keep moving your airbrush. You don't really want to dwell in one spot for very long unless you want a lot of coverage somewhere. Okay, move around here to the side. Again, this is going to be the top up here, so I want to spend a little bit more extra time, do a couple extra passes up here on the very top of it. And then just kind of like lessen the coverage a little bit as I get into this dark recess where these two panels go together. And the same is true here on the end. So you just want to start here on the extremity, and this will become more and more dramatic as we add extra layers over top. Okay, and we'll go in here and hit these spots. So on Wednesday, Will went through and was painting this exact same miniature, but he was going about it with a very different approach that uses makeup brushes, stippling over top. So if this seems like it's, you know, if you don't have access to an airbrush or you don't have the patience necessarily to paint all these interior details, you can certainly kind of seal up the entire miniature and paint it in a much more streamlined and simpler fashion. That also looks awesome. So it's kind of up to you what you want to do. But we figured because we're both going to be painting this miniature, we'd kind of approach it in two different ways and let you guys decide how you wanted to pursue it. And all of this, all of these raised bits on the wings are all going to be that same green. So I'm going to go ahead and paint all of those. I'm not worried about getting on the panels because I'll pick those out by hand afterwards. Here. But I do want to make sure that the you know, the edges of those things are green and they show up well. Other thing to bear in mind is, like, you know, the paint is always going to be a little bit lighter while it's still wet before it dries. So before you make a decision on whether or not you have enough layers on here, go ahead and let it dry, so you have a better idea of what the overall look is going to be like. Okay, and I think some of these little bits up here are exposed, so I'm going to go ahead and paint all those. And the interior of this little front bit, and this weapon underneath. I'm kind of just overspraying this a little bit. I'm keeping my distance. I'm moving kind of rapidly. I'm just letting the texture of the miniature kind of define where a lot of this paint rests. And any areas where parts kind of connect together and forms are kind of joining, I kind of leave a little bit of that darker color underneath. That'll be further defined once we add some washes out later on. But that'll probably be next week. Okay, that looks pretty good for my first color here. So why don't we punch up a little bit? I'm just gonna, because I still have some of this paint left in here, my subsequent highlights are I just add increasing amounts of this pale gray blue to the color. So I'm just gonna go ahead and keep the paint that I already had in there, and I'm just gonna add a little bit more to it, and then just procedurally add more and more of this color for each subsequent highlight. So I'll probably have to add a little bit more thinner because I added more paint, just to make sure it's still flowing nice. Again, just kind of eyeballing it, making sure that you're gonna just develop over time like a good feel for it, like how much you need to thin it and what it really needs to be like for the consistency. Yeah, it's only half of the ship because I'm going through the process of painting all of the interior detail, and in order for you to do that, you kind of have to leave it in two halves. Kind of similar situation with the Aa5, so yeah, make sure to check it out. Okay, so I've mixed up a little bit more of this gray here. I'm going to spray it over to the side. Bear in mind that there's usually a little bit of paint left in your airbrush from the previous color, so you want to spray it out a little bit until it is it's coming through as the color that you want. That one looks pretty good. So now for this, I'm going to kind of focus this a little bit more on these panels that are kind of raised, and also up on the top of the hull here, because this is where the light would shine. So just multiple passes. I'm making sure that I keep moving the entire time. There's some kind of raised bits here, so I'll start up here at the top, and I'll just kind of bring down a nice little highlight on top of that. Nice one there. And then when it's, you know, as I was mentioning before on these doors, starting up here at the top, starting up close, and then as you move down, move your hand further and further away from the miniature, and it'll start to create more of the fade that you really want. So you're starting to get that fade from light to dark. And you want to build that up with a couple colors, I think. It usually looks best if you do it in a few layers as opposed to just jump into high contrast right out the gate. A little bit there. We'll put a little bit up here on the top of this because some light would catch the top of that fin. All right, spin this guy around. Highlight that section. This part is a little bit raised. I want to leave a little bit of a shadow in there, so I'm going to try to get in here and paint in between those spots. Right in that little spot right there. And it's okay if you don't get the most perfect fade in here. It'll dry more subtle than it initially comes out. So we want some contrast here right around the edge of the door. We'll do the same thing on the bottom of this flap here. So start up close, and then start to move my hand further and further away. Cool. And for these steps, instead of going straight on them, I like to go down the steps so it'll leave the darker color underneath each step. So just kind of cascade down them, and that way it leaves it, I don't know if you can see it from the angle here. It's like nice and light from the top, but darker from underneath. And you can see the airbrush really does, it makes pretty quick work of a lot of these fades, a lot of these kind of like general transitions and lights and dark to kind of define the shape of the miniature. You can see why it is such a popular option for people, but certainly not a necessity when it comes to this stuff. It's just a tool. It's like anything else. You can choose whether to use it or not. But don't feel like you have to airbrush things in order to do this. You could also achieve this exact same approach with standard brush painting, maybe some sponges, lots of dry brushes. So I just kind of wanted to cover a little bit of the airbrush process, and then also just how to break this miniature apart so you can paint all this stuff inside. Oh, so we're starting to get some subtle kind of fades there. Let's take a look at it next to the other one and see how it looks comparatively. See if it is in the ballpark or if it needs to go lighter. I have a feeling it probably needs to go a little bit lighter. Oops. Well, it's getting there. It's pretty close. Yeah, I think maybe another layer up on top and we should be pretty good. Then I can transition over to painting some of the interior. I can flip this thing over and put the base coat down for the interior of the cockpit as well. Oh, I would love to see Janitor 99. That guy's like, he's one of my favorite characters. So just bear in mind with the airbrush, like the closer you get, the more fine the detail will be, you know, but also the higher the chance that it's going to start to pool and also kind of blow back a little bit. So you can see just how thin of a line you can achieve here, and as you move further away, it starts to get more and more diffused. And it's probably going to take a little time if you are not well versed when it comes to airbrushing, to really kind of learn the balance between air and paint, and you know how you need to kind of dial that in. But just practice. You can always practice on some old miniatures that you have, or pick up some toys from the toy store and practice on those if you want. And you can take this up as high as you really want to. I typically do about like 2 or 3 layers of progressively lighter colors, but if you really want high contrast, you can certainly do that. The miniatures in my army are a little bit more subdued, I guess. They don't have like a huge amount of crazy contrast, but that's just a personal preference. I just want them to look a little bit more gritty. But you could take this all the way up to a white if you really wanted to, and really make it pop. Okay, cool. Just going to punch up a little bit of this color up here on the very top. All right, so let's I have a little bit more of this paint left, so I'm going to go and hit a couple more spots down here on the bottom, and then I'm going to transfer over and I'm going to start doing the interior cockpit bit, because that's really kind of like the next thing that we want to do. And we're opting to, you know, to airbrush all of this stuff separately because we're worried about the overspray hitting any of those other colors that we want to have more contrast. So let me just clean out my airbrush here. And then I'm going to swap over to a lighter gray. How are we doing on time? All right, we still got 20 minutes. We got lots of time. Oh, that's this. Oh, I should probably explain that. So one thing that I also like to do here is I like to kind of back flush the airbrush a little bit, and you can do that by pinching the tip here, being very careful not to actually touch the needle very much. And then when you spray, it'll force the cleaner and stuff back through the airbrush and bubble it out, and it'll loosen up some of that stuff. Then you can just take it right to your spray pot. You can spray it all the way out. It helps to kind of move the trigger all the way forward and back just to make sure you work out any sort of paint that's there on the side of the needle on the inside. And I imagine in the future we'll do a little bit more detailed airbrushing, best practices, how to clean stuff, all that sort of thing as we proceed. But this is kind of our first foray into streaming airbrushing stuff, so we'll start off slow. All right. So on the flip side of this, and again, I can just bend this a little bit and I can pop the whole thing off because of that foam tape. On the flip side over here, we've got you know, this interior section, which I am going to go ahead and spray a dark color first, and then I will bring that up with some lighter colors, so it'll be kind of a nice light gray. And I'm going to do the same thing with the crew compartment that's in the back there. So again, I'm going to mix up a little bit of this graphene gray for the base. A little thinner in the cup. A little paint on the side. Use your brush to mix it all up. I'm just going to use straight air to blow out some of this debris that was in there. There's some plastic shavings and stuff that was inside. Oh, I'm seeing that I still had some of that leftover color that I had in there, so that's looking pretty wet and shiny, so I probably just want to let that dry. And you can just go straight air just by pushing straight down on the trigger first to help dry your surface if you want, without introducing paint into it. So let's do that, because it went on a little bit thick there. Okay, we'll let that dry for a bit. While that is drying, I'm going to move over here to the crew compartment section. Now, as I mentioned before, these are just kind of blue tacked on there. I just use some poster tack just to put them in place. So I'm going to clean all that off. Get any out of the cracks that we might have in there. And same story here. We're just going to kind of go through and apply this down into the shadows to make sure they're nice and dark. I think the floorboards in here, I'm actually going to paint black. But all this upper section up here, I want it to be a little bit lighter so I have good contrast against the miniatures that'll be in the back, which will be painted black and dark green as well. So just trying to decide on a color that'll give me the most contrast so this all the miniatures inside can pop. Over here. Okay, and I am out of paint. So again, we'll just kind of backflush this a little bit. Spray it out in the spray pot. I often wear gloves when it comes to airbrushing this stuff, but in this case, because I was mostly using this to actually hold on to stuff, not too much of a problem for me. But yeah, certainly gloves are a good option for you. If you want to make sure that you don't transfer any of the oils from your hand onto the surface. I think that, you know, airbrush paints especially can kind of react in weird ways to an oily surface, so you want to be careful with that. And now we're going to go with just straight pale gray blue. Mix that up, and because I don't want to jump up quite that high right off the gate, I'm going to add just a little bit of this graphene gray back into it, just to darken it down just a little bit. And we'll mix it up. That looks good. Okay, now we can go in here and let's start on this, because this section is still a little bit wet. You can still see a little bit of sheen there on that section, so we're going to let that dry. So let's go in and start to highlight up this interior cockpit, or crew compartment, I guess. And we're going to do the sides of the floor here. I'm just going to start up at the top, and then just kind of, as I move my way down, kind of increase the distance so I get that fade from the light to the dark. A little bit back here in the back. And we'll flip it around and do the same. Weird Rush does bring up a valid point, though, about gloves, because sometimes these thinners and things, they have chemicals and stuff in them that might react a little bit weird to your skin. I have never had that reaction, so I'm not too concerned with it, but I know some people have had that. So, yeah, I think some people definitely like to use gloves, especially when they're working with some of these thinner chemicals and some other stuff. But at your own discretion. Okay, that is looking pretty good. I wanted that fade from the light to the dark, and then once I paint that kind of center strip in there black, that's going to look pretty sweet. Okay, now I think this side is probably dry enough that we can start to go in here and spray paint all this. And again, we're working from darker to light, and that just helps by just picking out any of these raised areas and leaving that shadow. It's a lot easier to paint the raised surfaces than it is to try to chase in all of the shadows like a wash. And this is kind of the back area that goes behind the pilots themselves. And there's a lot of really cool detail on this inside. On either side, there are these like little controller screens. You've got the handles that kind of like lock in there on the side. It's yeah, it's really cool stuff. You probably won't see it terribly well once you actually seal everything back up, but I think it's cool that it's there. Whoops. All right. Just build this up a little bit more here. Awesome. All right. So the last little section that we have, and that what goes on the front of the cockpit section, is this window frame, and it's kind of similar in how the BX droids function, in that they have like a frame, and then you've got, you know, it goes over top, so it rests right over the top of the very section, over top of the clear plastic. This is a searchlight that actually bridges the two halves and goes on the underside. It goes right here. So I've left that separate so I can break this thing apart into 2 sections. And then each of these pilots will then rest inside on the cockpit areas, and the bottom of their chair goes into these little recessed holes right down there on the bottom. So the next thing I'm going to do right here is I'm going to airbrush up this part so I can get all the frame and stuff finished. I've got a little bit of this lighter color, so I'm going to go in reverse of what I normally did. And starting dark and working lighter, and I'm just going to go in light just because I still have some of the paint left and I don't want to waste it. So looking at this, it looks like the top side is this side, so I want this to be a little bit lighter in the top. So I'll make sure to focus my effort up there with this lighter color. And then I want this to kind of fade down into the dark, kind of like you see it as it is right now, where it's going to fade from that lighter color down to the darker color. Let me see if I can adjust this a little bit so you can see it a little better. That looks a little better, a little bit less glare. Okay, and I'm just going to use some straight air, and I'm just going to go over top of this to kind of dry it out a little bit more. Cool. And now let's go to that German gray that we had before, and we'll apply that from the bottom. Oops. Here we go. So I'm going to do some steps over the weekend so that next week, hopefully, we can wrap this up. So I will paint the crew and some things separately, but I will leave the actual painting of the interior of a lot of this detail for next stream. And just as a reminder, Will be finishing up his LAAT next Wednesday. We stream Tuesday through Friday every week. And I think after we're done with this 2-part series, I'm going to shift over and do some more content for Armada and for X-Wing for a while. So we'll just spray this through until we see the green again. That's what we want. So I want to start down here at the bottom and just increase the distance from the miniature as I get up towards into this white, to get a fade from that gray down into the green. And then I'll use, the side of my brush, and I'll go in and I'll do some edge highlights and stuff to this as well to kind of help define it. There's also one extra piece, actually a couple extra pieces here that I might as well just hit up. So this is a tail antenna that goes on the very back. Again, it bridges the 2 halves together, so I left it separate. But while I have this green in here, I'm just going to go ahead and hit that up as well. And then there are also some bits that go on the top, some of those kind of TIE Fighter-esque looking wings that I'll also hit up with this green. And that is probably going to cover most of what we're going to get done this week. If you are curious about how it's all going to turn out, make sure to come back next week and join us. And these are the sections that go up on the top. I've just left these things separate. They go on the top section there. But it just makes it a little bit easier to paint them separately, especially on the underside, because this is going to be kind of a hard area to reach. So all this green, I just really want to make sure to get onto the frame. We'll let that dry before I flip it over and handle it, because I don't want to put my hand in this wet paint. Okay. That fella. And there's also this one as well. Oh, thanks, Morsk32. I like this scheme too. It's fun. I think it looks just militaristic enough to pass for the Empire, but it's got some kind of real world connotations that I like. As far as just military kind of colors that you see in real world military. I have been staring at this LAAT for about 3 weeks now, just waiting for the time to paint it, so I am having a blast with this. Okay, and hold it by these little pegs underneath. Cool. All right, so next steps for me that I'm going to work on this weekend is I'm going to paint up both of these pilots. I am going to probably detail in and apply a wash and shade to one half of this so we can kind of see what that process is going to be like. Then I'll save the other half to actually go through and illustrate it. Before I actually apply that wash over top of it, because I'm going to use oil paints, I am going to apply a overcoat of, over top of everything. So this will all be sealed up, and the thin layers of paint will be protected. I'm also going to paint up these guys to go in the back, the two crew members there. And yeah, I think that largely covers the overall plan for what we're doing. Let me turn off this fan so you guys don't have to deal with that weird background noise. I guess the other step here is, and something that I didn't quite cover that I will touch on next week, is actually painting all this frame and stuff. I think that for this, as opposed to going just straight spraying it all, I am, even though I have masked it all off, I'm just a little nervous about paint getting in underneath. So I think I'm going to just brush it on by hand as opposed to spraying it all down. And then I'll kind of feather out the edges a little bit with some regular painting. And then we can pull all this tape off. I can glue on the front cockpit section to have this whole front section finished. And then hopefully we can get this thing all together so you can see what the finished product will look like. All right, well, I am going to move back over to this other camera here. So one moment. And we're back. So thanks again for joining me today. I had a lot of fun actually getting started on working on my LAAT. If you have any general questions, make sure to post those in the chat. As a reminder, we're going to be streaming next week. There's lots of more content coming in. You also have about 5 more days to get your entries in for My Star Wars Legion. If you use that hashtag on Instagram, it gets entered into our overall group of cool miniatures that we're going to show off on a future stream. So far, there is some amazing stuff in there, so it is super hard to choose what to pick and choose, but hopefully we can cover a lot of really cool stuff. Yeah, I think that's mostly it. So have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Take care.